Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this episode where we'll be looking at the maqasid of Sharia, and particularly on how the maqasid of Sharia, the higher intents and objectives of Sharia, regulate ijtihad, regulate the way scholars make laws. In today's episode, we will start looking at some of the factors that scholars consider when they come into lawmaking. I am your host, Muhammad Nuruddin Lemo, and with me to discuss these issues are two of our distinguished facilitators and volunteers with the Dawah Institute, Sister Salatu Saleh and Brother Nasir Bello. You're both most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
To Brother Nasir, could you introduce us to the type of factors that scholars consider when trying to ensure that in the application of the maqasid tools we find in usul, such as maslaha, saddu zariya, fathu zariya, istihsan, etc. What are those factors that scholars consider in order to ensure that laws are sensitive, nuanced to the realization of the maqasid of Sharia?
If you look at the tradition, particularly the primary sources of Sharia, Quran and Sunnah of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you will often find, particularly with the Sunnah, sometimes the text does not have sufficient information regarding the context, and that in a way create a difficulty or a problem in trying to contextualize application of this particular text. And therefore scholars utilize the knowledge of maqasid sharia to be able to find direction, to be able to differentiate, because you have sort of a frame of reference that you will always look to and compare the range or the kind of implication that is obtainable and possible. So it gives this sense of direction. It builds sort of a mental disposition for scholars in the process of doing ijtihad that guides them, and it fills in the gap that is created as a result of absence of this sufficient contextual information around the text of hadith of Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And another significant role the knowledge of maqasid does play is the role of supporting evidence, particularly when you have a variety of interpretation among scholars. It gives this evidence that will now support some of the interpretations that scholars can be able to do. And that is why you will find scholars emphasizing on the significance and the need to always triangulate, to always bring into play the perspective from maqasid, the perspective from qawaid, and that of usul, which is the common approach that usually scholars follow, because that will always protect the spirit of Sharia in general. That is the overall spirit, the overall objective of Sharia, and ensure that whatever ijtihad process a mujtahid is trying to do does not go beyond the provisions of the entire Sharia, what the Sharia hopes to achieve.
So basically what you're saying is, where we have a verse and there's some ambiguity regarding the objective it is trying to realize, what scholars do is go with the objectives that the remaining verses of the Quran are trying to realize on that subject. In other words, going with the maqasid. Sister Salah, what could you add to this question of factors to consider?
There are about 4 factors that the scholars consider when making certain decisions, when they have the maqasid in mind. To just list them very quickly, they consider the means, that is the wasa'il, as well as the ends, that is the maqasid. So they look at the purpose and they look at the means one. Another thing they consider is they also consider the overriding public benefit, that is looking at the general populace or the general community. They consider what is the benefit in this, the general benefits to accrue from this. Then they look at the question of harm, preventing harm. One thing they look at with regard to that is they consider the probability that harm will actually occur. Not just will it occur, but what's the probability, the chance of it occurring. Then they also consider the degree of harm that could occur, the severity of the harm, or the degree of benefit. So these are four broad things that they consider. To take the first one, this question of the means as well as the ends, that is the wasail and the maqasid. For the scholars and generally speaking in Islam, the purpose is always of greater importance than the means. Sorry, how you get to a certain place is secondary to where you headed in the first place. To use a quick metaphor, if you set off from the office and you are going home, what's really important is you are going home. So if you run into a traffic jam on one route, you just ask yourself, how long will I need to stay here before the road clears up? Or do I take another route home? There's no option of I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to even think about it. You would always think, because there's a place you want to get to. If you have to ditch your car because for some reason there's no other way to get home that night, you will. You may take certain steps to secure the car and all of that, but you will say, look, the car stays, I'm going home. So the maqasid, that's home for us, and how we get there, what laws, what rulings get us there, what actions, these are the means. And they said the end will always come before the means that will get us there. The maqasid are fixed. That's another important thing that the scholars bear in mind, that they are not changeable. Yes, we might say right now we are not considering this particular purpose, we are considering that other end, but the maqasid remain fixed. What changes is the means. It's the means that are malleable to change, that are flexible, that are fluid, that are context-based. So if the context changes, as the popular maxim goes, the ruling changes, but the purpose doesn't change. One more thing to consider is that for that reason, based on this importance of the purpose over the means, a threat to the purpose is taken far more seriously than threat to the means. Now, still looking at this, we look at let's look at a maxim that we've used before, mentioned before, that in contracts, liability is based on the maqasid and the ma'ani, meaning the purpose and the meaning, what was intended by the terms of that contract, not the words, alfaz, or the form, mabani. So even though you might say these are the words that are written here in this contract, this is how the contract is laid out, the question would be, especially where there's a debate or a conflict, what was intended? So you go right down once again to the ends, the purpose. And as we mentioned, the first maxim is al-umuru bimaqasidiha. All matters will go with their purposes and the intention behind them. In order to accomplish this, when scholars are looking at this whole idea of means and ends and trying to make sure they stay true to the purposes, they tend to employ those who say maqasid-oriented rules, the istidlal tools, that's istihsan, which we've talked about numerous times before, juristic preference, where the jurist is looking at what will bring benefit in this case to people generally. They also use maslaha as well. And even with istihsan, that's where the jurist may decide that I will not go with this ruling, I'll go with that ruling, looks for other alternatives. This is this whole idea of there's a purpose to be achieved and the means to get there might change. So metaphorically speaking, the jurist might decide it's better to go with a bicycle to get home than to say you wait until the bus comes, until the road clears up. And another tool they use is swadu daria. This is blocking the means. This is where something is ordinarily permissible, but where that permissibility becomes the route that will not get you home to the maqasid, then they block it and say, no, not this, because of the ends in mind. And examples of those are cases where one can eat pork if that is the only way to stay alive, to sustain oneself, or where ordinarily there are certain parts of the body that should not be exposed to a member of the opposite gender, but for the purpose of medical health care, or even in some cases when you have a crisis going on, such considerations may then be put on hold, so to speak.
Thank you very much. So, number one, you've mentioned the need to consider the consequences. In other words, what is being affected here? Is it the means that we are considering or the ends? And you've made it clear the ends are always a priority over the means. And we will come to how this actually plays out. Malan Nasir, what would you add to this?
Well, I think before even elaborating further on this issue of means and aid, and and the maqasid or the ends as a basis for consideration among scholars in trying to do their ijtihad, I think it's important to acknowledge the significance of the utilization of this knowledge of maqasid in trying to understand and interpret the text itself. Ordinarily, somebody would think, why would you just say maqasid when it is just talking about benefit and this is so rationalistic. But I think we have been able to establish that the entire purpose of Sharia, what Sharia hopes to achieve, is this accruing benefit and avoiding harm or preventing harm. And now what is interesting here for me is how one is able to see the level of sophistication and the rigor that usually scholars actually put in play, go through in trying to bring in or use the knowledge of maqasid in trying to arrive at that certainty. If we say we are going to make a ruling that will relax or restrict a certain hukum, then we need to establish the harm or the benefit and the extent or degree of the harm and the benefit, and not only that, the probability of its occurrence. So it's demonstrating how sophisticated and how difficult the entire process is, and that it's not just a simple thing that one does without really looking at the provisions and the knowledge nature of the whole process. Now, coming back to the very point Sister Salatu made regarding this issue of consideration of the means and the ends, you'll find lots of maxims that scholars look into in trying to talk about or in trying to employ this particular classification or use this, consider this issue of means and end. For example, this maxim of necessity, ad-darurat tubihul mahdurat, that necessity permits that which is prohibited. That is, anything that is darura, in a darura situation, that which is prohibited, as she gave a lot of examples, is also permitted. Under it you find the explanation that acknowledge the permission, the prohibition of means and end, that if something is prohibited, whatever leads to or whatever create a situation for prohibition itself is prohibited. ما لا يتوقف الحرام إلا به فهو إلا إليه ما يتوقف الحرام إليه فهو haram. That whatever haram leads to haram serve as a means for haram, it becomes also haram. Just like the other important maxim that you would find categorized under this about the other side of obligation, where it says ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو واجب. So that acknowledge that at the level of maqasid you have the obligations, of course, yes, and whatever lead to attainment of that particular benefit, that level of obligation itself is recognized as an obligation. And in the other episode in the past, we discussed about the examples of this, maxims, where we talked about the issue of fardu kifaya, of basic education in an attempt to provide doctors in the society, engineers in the society, something that community as a whole requires. Usually you find the wasila, the path, the means to attainment to that particular level becomes obligatory, just like the end itself becomes obligatory. So scholars looked at this means and end in trying to interpret certain texts and also bring in the idea of relaxation or restriction in the case of harm or benefit. And another important consideration they often do or often make in trying to engage or use this knowledge of maqasid is the consideration of overriding harm or overriding benefit. In this context, they are not only looking at good versus bad, but they are also looking at greater good and of course lesser evil. We also talked about a very important maxim in the past that talked about when you have two evils, you take the lesser one, and when you have two goods, you take greater good. وإن تضاهم عدد المصالح يقدم الأعلى من المصالح وضده تضاهم المفاسد يرتكب الأدنى من المفاسد, as explained by one of our great scholars, As-Sa'idi. Now,
Translate.
Okay, so what actually it says is when you have a lot of goods, when you are faced with the choice, when you are asked to choose between many good things, what you are expected to do is to look at the greater good. It's not about choosing any good, but the need for you to look at the greater good, which gives the greatest benefit. Just like if you are faced or you are forced to choose between evils, then you should look at the lesser evil. And we give a lot of examples, even in the life of Rasulullah, how certain times, how in some occasions, companions or even the Prophet, circumstance will necessitate him to choose lesser of all evils. There is a hadith where a companion complained to Rasulullah that he was forced to say some bad things against Rasulullah, otherwise he's going to be killed. And Rasulullah said, how did you feel when you were saying it? He said, I feel I even love you more. I feel my iman is even stronger. He said, if they ask you to do that tomorrow, you should repeat it. Allah knows that your heart is clean. So this, but uttering this particular thing is still evil. But then if you compare it with him being killed, which is at the level of the rura, now you will understand the wisdom behind choosing a lesser evil. We also cited example of the wisdom behind the concessions that Rasulullah did during the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, when some companions are feeling, Ya Rasulullah, why would you agree to this this kind of humiliating terms and unjust that visibly are to our disadvantage? But because of the greater peace that Rasulullah, the greater good, or because he's trying to avoid problem that is more severe, more disadvantageous to the entire Muslim community, that is why he decided to make this kind of choices. So this idea of impact assessment, trying to look at the degree of harm, trying to look at the level of good that you are able to accrue, and this is in line with the style of the Quran or the pattern of the Quran in trying to argue things and take them to the level of prohibition or permission. Look at the verses that prohibit alcohol, for example. When Rasulullah, when the Quran talked about إِنَّمَا الْكَمْرُ وَالْمَيْسِرُ وَالْأَنْصَابُ وَالْأَظْلَامُ رِجِسٌ مِّنْ عَمَلِ الشَّيْطَانِ, not that verse. يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ, when they ask you, when they were asking you regarding alcohol and gambling, he said, قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِسْمٌ كَبِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ. Tell them that in alcohol, in gambling, there is a great sin, but some benefit, and it has some benefit. So this idea of, okay, you can see the benefit acknowledged. You can also see that already Quran has acknowledged that the size of the harm and the problem, and therefore it went further to say وَإِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْئِهِمَا, that the harm, the problem, the sin, the disadvantage is even greater than the benefit. So this idea of that thinking, so what scholars actually are trying to do with this consideration for harm, greater harm and lesser evil, is going in line with the style of the Quran in approaching issues, in addressing problems. Just like you would find a lot of examples. For example, selling knife. Knife can be used to kill, and it can also be used to do a lot of activities, domestic activities at home. So scholars will say it's permissible because of the good it brings and the rarity of the other things or the disadvantages that it might bring. So much as it has a potential disadvantage, but at least you can see the good have outweighed the disadvantage. You have a form of weapons that probably by their nature you will assume that the disadvantages and the harm they might cause, if they have any benefit, is much more visible, and you will find scholars tilting towards prohibition. So this is one of the ways that scholars usually use in trying to measure the degree of harm, or what we call the degree of harm, and of course the level or the degree of benefit. Another good example is checkpoints on the road. It's inconveniencing, but if you look at what it does to the community, at least it sanitizes the community, it ensures security. Then you can be able, you can understand why it's better for you to consider to tolerate that level of inconvenience for greater good, because ultimately, if there are no checkpoints, then for you to even pass through the road will be a problem. So these are some of the examples you find. Another example you would find is a society that will now feel they are ready for jihad in the name of self-defense because they've been persecuted for a long time. And when you are persecuted and you know you are not strong enough to stand for yourself, you will continue to endure the persecution and the humiliation and the maltreatment and what have you. But when you get to the level that you feel you are strong enough, you can fight for your right, you can assert yourself and regain your freedom or gain your freedom for your own self, then you will find yourself trying to wage a war and defend yourself. That is very common to every civilization or society. And if you look at the Rasulullah and his companions, that was exactly what transpired. When they were persecuted in Mecca, Rasulullah will always tell them, be patient, kufu aydiyakum wa tuqimu salah, that you should relax and be patient. Time will come. But when the time comes, when Allah and the Prophet realize they are strong enough to stand for themselves, to fight back, the Quran tells them, أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ عَلَى نَصْرِهِمْ لَقَدِيرٌ. That permission is granted to those that are being persecuted, being fought, being killed out of injustice and oppression. And Allah has now granted them permission to stand for themselves, to fight for themselves, for their own right, to salvage themselves, to emancipate themselves. And Allah is going to assist them and help them in that process. So these are some of the examples you would find scholars bring in when it comes to trying to weigh this benefit and harm, trying to look at the overriding harm and of course the overriding benefit. Allahu Alam.
So, I mean, just a little, recap for the audience. Ijtihad and juristic reasoning is what is required when there is ambiguity or silence in the text. When that's the situation, they start ijtihad. Ijtihad is juristic reasoning using various tools of ijtihad, various sources of evidence or adilla. But in this juristic reasoning, scholars try to make sure that this reasoning is well guided. And where they are going to use tools like istihsan and maslaha and saddu zariya, where juristic reasoning is going to operate, the scholars want to make sure they narrow the error margin. And part of doing that is ensuring that this reasoning is also guided by not just usul, not just qawaid, which we've discussed, but also the maqasid of Sharia that are established by numerous texts. In this consideration of maqasid when making laws, they consider a number of things when it comes to lawmaking. One, the consequence. Are we talking about changing the maqasid or changing the wasa'il? So the need to distinguish between the two. Because the maqasid are more stable, it is the wasa'il and means that are more changeable. The second thing they consider is the overriding benefit. What type of evil are we dealing with? A greater evil or a lesser evil? And there, as you made clear, you choose the lesser one. If it is good, you choose the greater good. I'd like to ask Malam Nasir, what other factors do they consider? We've looked at, is it the means or the ends we are dealing with? Is it a greater or lesser evil? What's the overriding harm or the overriding benefit? So the need for that impact assessment and measurement. What else do they look into?
Well, another important thing they look into is the seriousness of the harm or the benefit. Is this a threat to necessities. For example, is it a threat to life?
The daruriyat.
Yeah, the daruriyat, that is at the level of daruriyat. For example, now the danger of COVID-19 and the issue of protocols. Is COVID-19 that is now disrupting the normal activities and the need for scholars to look into it? Is it a threat to the daruriyat, or a threat to another level that is much lower? And if it is a threat to the daruriyat, does it now permit, for example, suspending congregational prayer or suspending Hajj, which is a very critical pillar of Islam in order to save life? So they ask that particular question: what is the level of seriousness of the harm that it might afflict? Is it the level of, for example, stopping people to go to cinemas or to do, parties, which is perhaps somebody might argue entertainment, or at the level of survival of life? Comparing this is one of the questions they ask, level of seriousness. Or they might ask, is it at the level of haja? That is the level of, needs, something that is important needs, of course. Okay, another important consideration that the scholars look into is that consideration of importance and level of seriousness of the benefit or harm. And they ask a question: is it a threat to the level of daruriyat? For example, we've discussed what daruriyat are. That is the level of dire necessity, where you talk about threat to life, or threat to religion, or threat to wealth or mind. So is this particular issue at that level? Is it really posing a threat to life or to property, or you come down to the second level, that is the level of hajiyat? Is this threatening hajiyat, that is important needs? Probably you can think about institutions, since you talk about at the level of daruriyat, you talked about life itself. Then if you come down to the level of important needs, that is the hajiyat, where you look at threats to institutions that help in the promotion or preservation of life itself, a challenge, a threat to the educational institutions or educational system or the healthcare system, and many other things you would find around. So they also looked at it, whether it is a threat at the level of tahsiniyat, things that are actually luxuries, things that are not really a threat to life. It's not something that is really, although if you look at it in another things, there are a lot of nuances that are associated with that. So they ask a question like, they look at issues like toll gate in a road that is actually a shortcut, so it's only an issue of convenience, for example. So in trying to look at this, like we discussed about identifying the means and the aims, considering wasail and hadaf, or what we call the gaya or maqasid, or they look at the overriding harm, the degree of harm and the degree of benefit. They also look at the importance and seriousness of the harm and the benefit along this this vertical classification of the daruriyat, hajiyat and tahsiniyat.
So the more serious the offense, the more the concessions that go. Sorry, the more serious the threat. If it's a threat to life, you are ready to relax more laws than if it's a threat to haja. Exactly. Or if it's just an inconvenience, it may be so minor that it's not worth just to tell you know what, just bear with it. It's not that serious. Okay. Sister Salah, what other considerations would scholars take?
Another consideration is where, as Brother Nasir mentioned, it's clear there is some harm involved in this, but the scholars won't rush to make a decision just because there's harm. They would also look at the probability of that harm occurring, the likelihood that this thing is really going to be harmful. So they would look at cases where it is most definitely going to cause harm, where you are almost 100% sure. In such cases, they are more likely going to declare, they are more likely to bring a prohibition to prevent that harm from occurring. If they think it is very likely that harm will occur. So the probability is high, but not up to 100%. Then they may still declare that this thing is haram based on other factors they have considered. Let's look at a few quick examples. Digging a well in the middle of a road, especially a thoroughfare, is that very likely going to cause harm, or is it most definitely going to cause harm? Many scholars will say that's most definitely going to cause harm. So it would be made, they would prohibit such an act.
Especially if you don't say men at work or anything like that.
Especially where there's no sign or there's no indication, no warning is given. Or something like, narcotics, carrying or transporting this. Somebody might say, but I'm not taking it. I don't know what's going to be done with it. I'm just trying to make some money. From the point of view of the Sharia, that's not the point. What are narcotics usually used for? Especially when it's being transported not by an institution that is legitimate and for a purpose that is clear. So that would most likely come under most definitely harmful, therefore it should be prohibited. Another example would be a case where in a highly Islamophobic city or state or country, the permission given to Muslim women to go out without wearing their khimar, in short, look as un-Muslim, if I can put it that way, as possible. Many would say the risk is probably high. There's a high probability that she could be attacked because of the degree of Islamophobia, and she would be given permission to take that hijab off. In some cases, they might even go so far as to insist, take it off because life comes before the hijab. Another example is selling grapes to someone who makes alcohol. You might say, well, he might want it for fruit juice, he might want it just to eat, he might be having a party. But again, the scholars would weigh probability that this would be used to make alcohol, and based on that, they may discourage it if they think based on the circumstances, there are other uses this might be put to, or they might say it's prohibited to go into such a contract. Now, the examples I've given so far could fall on either side of most definitely risky or very probably risky. As I mentioned, the scholars would still look at other factors besides the single factor in making a decision.
Okay, so what you are saying is this spectrum. So it's not just enough for the scholar to ask themselves, is this affecting means or harm?
Yeah.
They want to look at the overriding
Means
benefit.
ends,
Yeah, overriding benefit.
Yes.
They want to look at, is it a greater evil? Is it a lesser evil?
Yeah.
They want to look at how serious is it? Just is this daruriyat, threatening one or less? You're bringing the risk assessment, the probability of it happening. So it may be bad, but if it is highly probable that it would happen, they are comfortable saying it is haram. If they are certain, they are comfortable saying it's haram. So you're saying there's certain, there's highly probable. What would you add to this?
Well, I think other cases or options in the spectrum are maybe it's probable. It's probable in the sense that it has slight risk, and that you find with the harm that is associated with normal jobs like risk in fishing, or the risk that is associated with mountain climbing, or the risk in hunting, or the kind of risk that is associated in the construction industry. Or in another example, you might think about a lady traveling alone in a road that is relatively safe. There is no any record of any problem of insecurity associated with that particular road. So still on the spectrum, you would find what we call rare occurrence, which, of course, if it is probable, there is no basis for prohibition. That is clear. There is no basis for prohibition because the risk is it's highly unlikely. It's really probable, and therefore you would find it falling on within the category of what scholars would call mubah, going back to the original, the norm impermissibility. Others that are a bit conservative probably will take it to the level of makruh. Now the next stage in the spectrum is rare occurrence, something that is not risky at all, because the occurrence of such kind of thing is sometimes imaginative. The preponderance of the experience that actually is recorded in this kind of things is that it's risk-free. Something like, say, male and female in the same place, in an open place, trying to do something, probably acquire knowledge, may lead to fitna. Or you see Western education is going to lead to immorality because it allows for the participation of men and women in the same place. So this kind of things, or this kind of examples that you would think they are at the level of whims and imagination, but in reality these are things that are not associated with what obtains. So they occur quite rarely, and even if they happen, you cannot associate them to the happenings around that, but other things probably that lead to that particular thing. So this is another situation when it comes to nature of occurrence of incidents in that kind of nature. And scholars, of course, will stick to their permissibility as a position, because there isn't anything that is necessitating a shift from what actually is known. That is the issue of permissibility as the norm in this particular situation.
Thank you. Salah, what would you add to this?
In handling these different cases and scenarios that we've discussed, the truth is that when it comes to, real life, applied life, what goes on in society, there are so many factors that come into play that every challenge that we face, every problem that arises, that a ruling has to be given, a position has to be taken, every one of them comes as a result of a variety of factors. These changes and these challenges in society are multifaceted. Therefore, in trying to solve them, in trying to move forward to attain the greatest degree of benefit to the highest number of people and reduce the harm to its barest minimum, it requires the input of people from different aspects, different facets of that same issue or context or society. It also requires the intellectual humility, both of those who are seeking the solutions and those who have some of the answers, whether they are the mujtahids, the muftis who have deep knowledge of the Islamic sciences, or the experts of reality who have deep knowledge of the problem on ground, or the people who are experiencing the problem and are saying, is there an answer? Do you have an answer? What's the ruling? So it requires input from many and intellectual humility from all.
I think, that because this is dealing with assessing benefit and harm, looking at what's the risk, and the point that has just been made clear by the two of you is, it's not enough to say something is haram because it can possibly cause harm.
Yeah.
But what is the risk? What's the probability of occurrence? And in the examples you've given, it's possible that somebody can die on their way to work. It's possible that a woman is raped on her way to the mosque. But compared to the benefit of going to the mosque, when you also look at when last was somebody raped on their way to the mosque, you don't say, since it has happened or it just happened yesterday, we will make a new law to say it is haram for women to go to the mosque. So to distinguish the possibility of something happening with the level of risk of occurrence. And I think this is one reason also why it is important to get people who are good in risk assessment, to get people who, and depending on the field, so that people are not making laws and fatwas are not being given just on the level of pessimism or optimism of the individual scholar using anecdotal evidence, but that there is consultation with experts of the field, there's some empiricism, there's some moving in search of greater certainty. Al-yaqin la yazulu bi-shak. In other words, move to where there's greater certainty. And this, I think, underscores the importance of local knowledge and specialists when it comes to juristic reasoning, and there's the need to measure the amount of harm or benefit, or the frequency or the risk involved. The other thing is what you've said. When it comes to measuring harm, and somebody says this is a greater evil or lesser evil, because in a lot of this discussion of rukhsa and licenses that are going to relax laws, block means, permit what is haram, or prohibit what is halal, depending on whether it's fatu zariya or saddu zariya, maslaha, or any of these other tools. What kind of factors, Sister Salah, what kind of factors do scholars consider in determining, is this a greater evil or is this a lesser evil? Is it just the severity of the harm? What could you wrap on? What do scholars consider?
I think to answer that, we'll refer to two maxims. Ad-darar yuzal, so harm should be eliminated. Al-mashaqat tajlibu at-taysir, the person in that situation of difficulty should get some concessions. Why I'm referring to these two maxims is because they highlight that when it comes to problem solving and harm prevention or benefit creation, don't just look at the thing, look at the people involved or impacted upon. So far we've talked about the harm itself, its severity, its probability, is it something that threatens the means or the ends. One other factor that the scholars look at is the people involved. They would consider questions such as, how many people are going to actually benefit from this? That would warrant a shift in whichever direction. How many people are going to be harmed by this? That would warrant a shift in whatever direction. If we use the example that has come up here of people go to work every day, there is always the chance that an accident will occur. So I'm speaking in an extreme case, should we therefore stop people from driving cars and say, you know what, everybody is going to work, so that, ride a bicycle or something, so that we reduce the likelihood or the severity of car accidents just because we want to prevent harm to one person? No. In a real sense, the scholars would look at those factors, like that one of stopping women from going to the mosque so that the women don't get raped. It has happened before, yes, but to one woman. So how many people are we talking about? So they look at the number of people. They look at the range and the scope. So how widespread, like when you talk of the distribution of people who will be affected, is it a problem that can be contained because it's localized, or it's widespread? That's the difference, for instance, between the kind of ruling that might be given in cases of epidemic versus cases of pandemic. Epidemic, more localized. Pandemic, more widespread. So the scholars would actually look and weigh that kind of thing. They would also consider which people. So even if, for instance, the number of people who will be affected is less than another situation where they would say, oh, this is more serious, they would look at the nature of the people affected. So they would consider things like, let's say in cases of diseases and illnesses, they would consider the strength of the people who might be impacted upon, as we have with COVID-19, where a lot of concern was for people with compromised immunity. The scholars would also consider, is it children we're talking about? Is it the aged ones we're talking about? And if it's a case where you need the services of a particular profession or skills of a particular set of people or a guild, then they become a priority. They are shifted upwards, and certain important rulings and decisions can be made because of these people, even if the number is low. That's another. Then they also consider duration. They would say, okay, they've looked at the people who were distribution and intensity, but for how long? Is it something that's going to last for half a day, a week, a month? Because when the duration tied in with other factors makes the scholars and the experts say, if we just let things stand as they are, we maintain status quo, we go by way of istishab, leave things as they are, in a short while it's going to be over and we'll all be fine. But again, we said they weigh all these factors we've considered, not just one. Oh, somebody is going to be hurt and then the rush off. No. As you mentioned earlier, the scholars do put in a lot of rigorous thought and work and critical thinking before these decisions are made. Wallahu a'lam.
So you've mentioned the issue of number and scope. So if something bad will affect more people, it is worse than if something bad will affect less people.
Yes.
If something bad will affect people who are strong, in other words, not going to really have an impact,
They will recover quickly.
they will recover quickly. It's not as bad as affecting people with underlying conditions or people who are already weak. So say a new tax law that's going to just make poor people poorer would, even though they may be fewer, it would be taken more seriously. The duration, an evil that is going to be temporary would be considered a lesser evil compared to an evil that is going to last longer.
Yeah.
What other factors, Alan Nasir?
Well, I think some of the other factors they look at are the nature of the effect. Is it permanent? Is it temporary? For example, nuclear or radioactive waste or biodegradable waste or pollutant. So they look at that. And another important factor they look at is this issue of reversibility. Is it reversible or non-reversible? Is there any option for coming back to the status quo? Or it's something that if it happens, that's all. You can't do anything. Is it threatening extinction of species? For example, things like deforestation or war and the effect it might cause to the society. And again, they also look at some other domino side effects that are always in play and consequences. Things like climate change, things like security issues, of course, COVID-19, issues of economic inequality, things that they will have, somehow they will affect, they will always key in and affect the situation or the nature of this. So they look at all these things in trying as factors that are critical in weighing and measuring and trying to assess situations and the impact and benefit.
I think this only highlights why, especially in contemporary society, you really need more specialists. And I think we find that increasingly in the Islamic medical field, Islamic finance field, where more experts are coming in because it's no longer easy for the alim or the scholar to assess how many people is this going to be affecting compared to another policy. How permanent is this going to be? What are the side effects or consequences, desirable or undesirable? What some would call strategic impact assessment or cumulative impact assessment, total or holistic impact assessment. What could you say regarding, therefore, the role of professionals? Because I think the fact that scholars need this information in order to even decide, is this a greater evil or lesser evil? That the assessment of that maslaha and mafsada requires professional input would imply that as we move into the future, professionals will be playing a much greater role in the assistance of specialists in this area. What roles do you think scholars or specialists and professionals have to play?
I think some of the key things that we need to bear in mind and of course some of the critical things that necessitate the increasing role of experts and specialists in this issue of assessment is the need for clarity and certainty that Islam kept emphasizing. And we all know Islam is, for a Muslim, is the entire way of life. And if we are talking about way of life, particularly in our contemporary time, is quite, it's something that is beyond the scope of scholars of fiqh or scholars of jurisprudence or scholars of Islamic science. It needs expertise, particularly in this trying to assess harm and benefit, particularly according to the way it has been highlighted and mentioned and elaborated. And if you look at the tradition or the history of Islam, you would find Rasulullah being open really to this idea of consulting experts. And the whole idea or the general idea of consultation itself in the religion has a basis. And remember this incident where Rasulullah advised some companions about some form of agriculture, breeding, and it didn't work, and they reported to him, and he said, Antum a'lamu bi umuri dunyakum. You are the ones who know better affairs of your own world. Sometimes on the issues to do with military strategy, Rasulullah will make a suggestion, and companions that are very much knowledgeable in those areas will ask, Ya Rasulullah, is it a revelation or just your idea? You will say, no, this is just me thinking. They will say, okay, I think this is a better idea. Meaning, Rasulullah will buy into their own idea, and it will turn out better. So this idea, the need for scholars and Muslims generally to understand the need to expand the frontiers of fatwa and ijtihad and accommodate the role of experts, because these are things that the issue of assessment, the issue of measuring risk and measuring harm and benefit, I think everybody knows is beyond the scope of scholars of the text, and therefore there is a need for experts in different fields to join the scholars in trying to resolve this kind of issues or address this kind of problems. And that is why you find many great scholars in today's world advocating for this issue of accommodating or constituting fatwa councils where experts and scholars will sit together, analyze problems, and come up with better solutions and better response or solutions to this kind of issues. What you find usually is if scholars insist on coming up with fatwas over issues of this nature, you would find them making a lot of mistakes, because it's beyond actually just listening to the ideas of one or two people for you to make sense and understand and even come up with a ruling over it. It requires some depth and appreciable level of expertise in this particular field, and therefore that necessitated having experts, the scholars of ayat, the scholars of the science of Allah, of Allah's creation, coming together with the scholars of the text, Quran, Hadith, jurisprudence, and analyzing these issues and coming up with better solutions for the Ummah.
Sister Salah, what would you add here?
Yeah, there's that maxim that the necessity should be measured according to its due proportion. So I think this discussion right now has reached this point where we are talking about what is the due proportion and who measures that, and how well scholars can work with the experts in the field to measure that. They're not just the experts in the field, but what is the form of measurement? So there's a need for objective tools, methods of research, methods of study, and also using available tools, including technology, to collate data, to analyze data, and by so doing to arrive at decisions and policies that will bring the greatest possible benefit to people and reduce any harm whatsoever to the barest minimum. It's also important, I think, that Muslim professionals, people in various fields, are more in touch with what is going on at the level of fatwas that are being given, so that if they observe that something is being done without adequate information or accurate information from the reality of what's going on, they speak up, they lend their voices to that whole scenario discussion.
This is very, very interesting. And, just to wrap up on the points you've made, and the last point in particular, how unfortunately many Muslim professionals expect the ulama to give fatwas relevant to mental health when they know very little about mental health. They know very little about psychiatry. We find people expecting Muslim scholars to give guidelines on cybercrime and cyber security when some of them don't even know what cyber is, and would like to blame the ulama, and the need for professionals to not be waiting for fatwas from the ulama, because that's the usual source of of fatwas, but to take responsibility, to invite the ulama, but they also to recognize that they are also the most knowledgeable about their areas. You know, the hadith you brought where the Prophet ﷺ said, Antum a'lamu bi umuri dunyakum, you know, on certain specialized areas, you are more knowledgeable. And what is required there is simply the assessment of harm and benefit. Because even if you ask the scholar, what the scholar wants to understand is it, you know, what's the greater evil, what's the lesser evil, which is usually a product of impact assessment, but to make sure that you are not conflicting with any injunctions of the Quran or the Sunnah, and that you consult with people who know the maqasid of Sharia and what Islam expects, but to reduce the naivete among Muslim professionals in waiting for fatwas, when what they could do and what many have been doing is set up fatwa councils, invite scholars who can advise, get more educated, discuss and deliberate, and arrive at conclusions that respect the Quran and Sunnah, respect the maqasid of the Quran and Sunnah, the objectives of the Quran and Sunnah, and that bring benefit to society as a whole. I'd like to thank you both for your contributions and the discussion. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.